Picture a man standing in a dusty marketplace, wrists bound in front of him, waiting his turn on an auction block, while a crowd haggles over his price like he's a sack of grain or a length of rope. He was not born into this. He was, not long ago, a respected trader, a man with his own home, his own animals, a wife who loved him, and friends who respected him. Now he stands in chains, being sold as a slave to pay off debts he can no longer escape any other way, and the man buying him barely looks him in the eye, because to that buyer, he isn't really a person anymore. He's simply a debt, walking on two legs, about to be put to work until that debt is considered paid. This actually happened over and over in the ancient city of Babylon, thousands of years ago, in a place where debt slavery wasn't some rare tragedy whispered about in hushed tones. It was common enough that everyone in the marketplace understood exactly what was happening the moment they saw those bound wrists, and exactly why. Here's the question I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because the answer is going to surprise you in a way that connects directly to your own life, thousands of years later, in a world that looks nothing like ancient Babylon on the surface, and yet somehow still runs on the exact same underlying rules. How does a man go from owning a home, animals, and the respect of his entire community to standing bound in a marketplace, being sold like property? And more importantly, once a person falls that far, is there actually a way back? Because there's a specific man in this exact situation whose story we're going to follow closely today. A man who did claw his way back, using a set of principles so simple, so old, that they were literally carved into clay tablets thousands of years before modern banks, modern investment accounts, or modern paychecks ever existed. And here's the part that should genuinely astonish you. Those same principles, unchanged, word for word in their underlying logic, are still exactly what separates people who build lasting wealth from people who never quite manage to, right now, today, in your own city, whatever century you happen to be living in. Let's go back to Babylon itself for a moment, because before we follow that enslaved trader's path back to freedom, we need to understand the city he actually came from, and why it became, for a certain stretch of ancient history, one of the wealthiest cities the world had ever seen. Babylon sat on land that, by itself, wasn't particularly fertile. The soil was dry, the climate was harsh, and there were no natural gold deposits or precious gems buried beneath its streets, waiting to be discovered. And yet, through irrigation, through disciplined engineering, through generations of deliberate, patient effort, the people of Babylon transformed the dry, unremarkable land into some of the richest farmland in the ancient world, and Babylon itself into a city famous for its wealth. A wealth that had nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with a specific way of thinking about resources, about effort, about patience. That same underlying mindset, the one that transformed dry land into fertile farmland, is exactly what shaped how individual citizens of Babylon thought about their own personal money as well. And it's precisely why this ancient city became the setting for one of the most enduring sets of financial lessons ever recorded. Now, the first was named Banseer, a builder of chariots, skilled at his craft, someone who worked hard every single day, shaping wood and metal into vehicles that Babylon's wealthy citizens relied on. The second was named Kabi, a musician, someone who played the lyre at gatherings and celebrations across the city. Both men worked consistently. Both men were respected in their trades. And both men, despite years of steady work, found themselves exactly where they'd started financially, with barely enough silver to cover their basic needs, no savings, no security, nothing set aside for the future at all. One evening, sitting together after a long day, Banseer finally said out loud, something he'd been quietly feeling for years. He'd worked hard his entire life, he said, and yet he had nothing to show for it beyond the roof over his head and the tools of his trade. Meanwhile, there was a man in their city, someone they'd both known since they were boys, who had become so extraordinarily wealthy that people now called him the richest man in Babylon. His name was Arkad, and Bansir couldn't understand it. They'd grown up together, learned similar trades, had similar opportunities early in life. Why had Arkad become fabulously wealthy while he and Kabi remained exactly where they'd started, working just as hard, year after year, with nothing meaningful to show for it? This is the exact question that opens the entire story we're about to walk through together, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it's almost certainly a question you've quietly asked yourself at some point too. Why do some people, working no harder than everyone around them, sometimes working considerably less, end up building genuine, lasting wealth, while others, working tirelessly for decades, remain stuck exactly where they started? Bansir and Kabi decided to do something most people, even today, rarely actually do. Instead of simply resenting Arkad's success from a distance, they went directly to him and asked him honestly to explain his secret. And Arkad, to his credit, didn't brush them off, didn't pretend his success was some mysterious stroke of fortune reserved only for the specially chosen. He agreed to explain exactly how he'd done it, and in doing so, he revealed something that would eventually be passed down, taught, and repeated for thousands of years afterward. Arkad explained that he hadn't always been wealthy. In fact, he'd started with even less than either Bansir or Kabi currently had. He'd worked as a humble scribe, copying laws onto clay tablets for a modest wage, watching wealthier men walk past his small workspace every single day, men who could afford homes, animals, and comforts that felt, at the time, completely out of reach for someone in his position. One day, a wealthy moneylender named Algamish came to Arkad's workspace, requesting a specific tablet be copied by a certain deadline. Arkad worked through the night to finish it in time, and when Algamish returned to collect the tablet, he was impressed enough by Arkad's diligence that he made him an unusual offer. He offered to teach Arkad the secret of building wealth in exchange for Arkad's continued hard work copying more tablets for him. Arkad, hungry for exactly this kind of knowledge, agreed immediately. And here's what Algamish told him. Algamish told him that a part of all he earned was his to keep. Not all of it, simply a part, specifically, at minimum, 1 out of every 10 coins that passed through his hands, set aside before anything else was spent, protected completely from ever being touched for ordinary expenses. Arkad initially struggled to actually follow this advice, and it's worth pausing on exactly why, because his struggle mirrors almost exactly what most people experience today when they first try to save consistently. He found that his usual expenses always seemed to expand to consume every coin he earned, no matter how much or how little that happened to be. There was always something that seemed to require spending that 10th coin instead of saving it, a small pleasure here. When Algamish returned and asked how the saving was going, Arkad admitted his failure honestly, and Algamish's response became one of the most important ideas in this entire story, one worth sitting with directly, because it applies just as much today as it did in ancient Babylon. He told Arkad that his expenses would always rise to meet his income, unless he deliberately, consciously decided otherwise. He explained that this wasn't a flaw unique to Arkad. It was simply how most people naturally behave, spending everything they earned, regardless of how much that happened to be, purely because nothing forced them to do otherwise. The solution, Algamish explained, wasn't to try harder to resist temptation using pure willpower alone. It was to set the 10th coin aside first, immediately, the moment income arrived, before any spending decisions were even made, treating that saved portion as though it were an obligation as unavoidable as any debt, rather than a leftover that might happen if there was anything spare at the end. This time, Arkad succeeded, and he described something that surprised him deeply once he actually committed to it. Living on 9 coins instead of 10 turned out to be far easier than he'd initially feared, because he simply adjusted his spending habits to fit within that smaller amount, exactly the way people naturally adjust to whatever income they're given, whether that income is large or small. The 10th coin, meanwhile, sat completely untouched, growing slowly, month after month, and Arkad described watching that small, protected pile of coins with a feeling he'd never quite experienced before. A genuine, tangible sense that he was finally building something real, something that belonged entirely to him, rather than simply passing every coin straight through his hands toward someone else's benefit. Here's the pause worth taking right now, honestly, with nobody else watching. If you set aside 1 coin out of every 10 you earned, starting today, before spending anything else, do you genuinely believe you could adjust your life to function on the remaining 9? The same way Arkad eventually discovered he could, because, according to this ancient story, and honestly, according to nearly every modern piece of financial wisdom that's ever built on top of it since, now, Arkad's story doesn't end simply with saving that 10th coin, because saving alone, while essential, was only the first piece of what Algamish eventually taught him. The second piece came, somewhat painfully, through an actual mistake, one Arkad made early in his journey, and one worth walking through honestly, because it reveals something important about the difference between saving money and actually growing it wisely. Once Arkad had accumulated a modest sum through his consistent saving, a bricklayer approached him with an opportunity, explaining that he was preparing to travel to a distant city to buy rare gems that could then be resold in Babylon at a significant profit. He asked Arkad to invest his savings in this venture, promising a substantial return once the gems were sold. Arkad, eager to grow his money faster than simple saving alone could manage, agreed, handing over his carefully accumulated savings to a man who, however well-intentioned, actually knew nothing meaningful about gems at all. The venture failed completely. The bricklayer, lacking any real expertise in evaluating precious stones, was sold worthless glass instead of genuine gems by a dishonest merchant in the distant city, and Arkad's entire savings, painstakingly built up 1 careful coin at a time, vanished in a single, poorly considered decision. Here's the lesson Arkad drew from this failure, one that became a permanent part of his approach going forward, and one that Housel's modern work on psychology would later echo almost word for word thousands of years afterward. He realized that saving money was only useful if that money was then protected, invested wisely, guarded from unnecessary risk, rather than simply handed to anyone who promised an attractive return without actually possessing genuine expertise in whatever venture they were proposing. From that point forward, Arkad made a rule for himself that would eventually become one of the central lessons he passed down to others. Before investing any of his hard-earned savings, he would first seek advice from people who had genuine, proven experience in that specific area, rather than relying purely on the confident promises of whoever happened to be asking for his money at the time. He learned, the hard way, slowly, carefully, learning from each mistake without ever completely abandoning the effort altogether. Arkad continued saving his 10th coin, continued seeking genuine wisdom before investing any of it, and gradually, over years, his wealth began to grow, not explosively, not overnight, but steadily, consistently, in exactly the way compounding tends to work when given enough patient time. Eventually, his growing wealth caught the attention of the king of Babylon himself, who, facing financial difficulties within his own treasury, called upon Arkad specifically to teach his methods to a broader group of citizens, so that the entire city might benefit from whatever wisdom had made Arkad so remarkably successful. Arkad agreed and gathered a group of citizens in a great hall, where he taught them what became known as the 7 cures for a lean purse. Let's walk through them together, because each one deserves its own real attention. The first cure was simply this: start thy purse to fattening, meaning set aside at least 1/10 of everything you earn, every single time you earn anything at all, treating that portion as sacred, untouchable, protected from every other expense in your life. Arkad explained to his audience exactly what he'd explained to himself years earlier, that their expenses would always rise to consume whatever they earned, unless they deliberately, consciously decided otherwise, setting that 10th coin aside before any other spending happened at all. The second cure was to control thy expenditures, and this one, Arkad explained carefully, wasn't about depriving yourself of everything you enjoyed. It was indefinitely, unless deliberately examined and constrained. He suggested that everyone in that room write down exactly what they genuinely needed to live well, and compare that honestly against what they were actually spending, very often discovering a meaningful gap between the two, a gap filled entirely with spending that had crept in gradually, unnoticed, over years of simply not paying close attention. The third cure was to make thy gold multiply, meaning invest that saved money wisely, seeking out opportunities where it could grow on its own, generating additional income over time, rather than simply sitting untouched, protected but stagnant. Arkad explained that gold, once saved, should be put to work, earning more gold on its own, exactly the way a farmer plants seeds expecting a harvest, rather than simply storing those seeds away indefinitely without ever planting them at all. The fourth cure was to guard thy treasures from loss, and this directly echoed the painful lesson Arkad had learned from the bricklayer and his worthless gems. He warned his audience specifically against the temptation of unusually high returns promised by people lacking genuine expertise in whatever venture they were proposing, urging them instead to seek the counsel of people with proven, demonstrated experience before ever risking their carefully saved money on anything unfamiliar. The fifth cure was to make of thy dwelling a profitable investment, encouraging his audience to work toward owning their own homes rather than paying rent indefinitely to someone else, since money paid toward rent, he explained, was money that could never be recovered or grown, whereas money paid toward eventually owning your own home was money that stayed within your own control. The sixth cure was to ensure a future income, urging his audience to think beyond their current working years, setting aside resources specifically intended to support them once they were no longer able to work as actively as they currently could, recognizing that a plan made only for the present, without any consideration for the future, was, in his words, an incomplete plan at best. And the seventh cure, perhaps the one Arkad considered most foundational of all, was to increase thy ability to earn, encouraging his audience to continually develop their own skills, their own expertise, their own value in whatever trade they practice, recognizing that a person's capacity to earn money in the first place was itself an asset worth deliberately investing in and improving over time. These 7 cures taught in that great hall thousands of years ago, spread throughout Babylon, and citizens who genuinely applied them consistently over years found themselves gradually building the exact same kind of quiet, lasting wealth that Arkad himself had built, starting from nothing more than a scribe's modest wage. Now, let's return to that man standing bound in the marketplace, the one we opened this entire story with, because his path back to freedom runs directly through these exact same principles, applied under far more desperate circumstances than most people listening to this will ever personally face. His name was Dabasir, and before his enslavement, he had actually been a respected camel trader, someone who understood commerce, who had built a comfortable life for himself and his family through years of steady work. But Dabasir made a series of decisions that, individually, each seemed reasonable enough at the time, and collectively, over several years, buried him under debt he could no longer manage. He'd spent freely, but business didn't always pick up exactly when he expected it to, and each new loan he took to cover the previous one only deepened the hole he was quietly digging for himself. Eventually, his debts grew so large and his ability to repay them so limited that his creditors, following the harsh customs of ancient Babylon, had him sold into slavery, his labor now belonging entirely to whoever purchased him, until his debts were considered paid through years of forced work. Dabasir was purchased by a man who put him to work tending camels in the desert, far from the city, far from any comfort or dignity he'd once known, and for a long stretch of time, Dabasir simply endured this existence, believing there was no genuine path back to the life he'd lost. Then, one day, while performing his duties, Dabasir encountered a group of clay tablets that had been brought into the household, tablets containing writings passed down from wise traders, recording principles remarkably similar to those Arkad had once taught in that great hall in Babylon. Reading those tablets, alone in the desert, tending camels that weren't even his own, something shifted inside Dabasir, and he made a decision that would eventually define the rest of his life. He decided that even from his current position, enslaved, seemingly with nothing at all, he would begin applying these exact same principles, starting immediately, regardless of how hopeless his situation genuinely appeared. He began by mentally dividing whatever small amount of value he could generate for his master, setting aside, at least in his own careful accounting, a portion for himself, even though he technically owned nothing at all in his current circumstances. He began treating his current work, not as meaningless forced labor, but as an opportunity to prove his own reliability and skill, hoping that demonstrated competence might eventually earn him greater trust, and perhaps, eventually, greater freedom. Slowly, through consistent, careful effort, Dabasir earned enough trust from his master that he was given increasing responsibility, eventually trading camels on his master's behalf in nearby markets, and within that limited freedom, he began applying the exact same principle Arkad had once learned from Algamish, setting aside a small portion of whatever modest earnings came his way, even while technically still enslaved. He also did something that required real courage, given his circumstances. He began carefully planning how he would eventually repay every single one of his original creditors. Not simply escape or ignore the debts he'd once accumulated, but genuinely repay them, piece by piece, once he had the means to do so, recognizing that true financial freedom required not just accumulating new wealth, but also honestly settling the mistakes of his past. Years passed. Dabasir's careful, patient effort, applied consistently under circumstances far harder than almost anyone listening to this will ever personally experience, value Dabasir had demonstrated over years of reliable service, Dabasir returned to his own city, not with the wealth he'd once had before his enslavement, but with something arguably more valuable, a genuine, hard-won understanding of exactly which habits actually built lasting financial stability, and which habits, however reasonable they'd seemed at the time, had originally led him into the very slavery he'd just escaped from. He systematically tracked down each of his original creditors, and rather than avoiding them out of shame, he approached each one directly, honestly explaining his situation and proposing a specific, disciplined plan to repay every debt he still owed, a portion at a time, from his newly rebuilt trading income. Some creditors were skeptical at first, having assumed they'd never see repayment after so many years. But Dabasir followed through, consistently, patiently, exactly as he'd promised, and over time, he repaid every single debt he'd once owed, while simultaneously continuing to save and invest a portion of his growing income, using the exact same principles that had first helped him survive his years of enslavement. Eventually, had originally destroyed his first fortune entirely. Here's the specific set of ideas Dabasir carried forward from those clay tablets he'd first encountered in the desert, principles that became known as the 5 Laws of Gold, worth understanding clearly, because they explain not just how wealth is built, but how it's so often lost as well. The first law states that gold comes gladly, and in increasing quantity, to any person who sets aside at minimum 1/10 of their earnings to create an estate for their own future and for the future of their family. The second law states that gold labors diligently and profitably for the wise owner who finds a genuinely useful purpose for it, growing steadily, much like livestock multiplying in a well-tended field. The third law states that gold clings to the protection of a cautious owner, someone who invests it carefully, under the guidance of genuine expertise, rather than someone who invests it carelessly, chasing whatever opportunity happens to sound most exciting in the moment. The fourth law states that gold slips away from the person who invests it in businesses or purposes they don't genuinely understand, or that aren't approved by genuine experts in that specific field. Exactly the mistake Arkad himself made with those worthless gems, and exactly the mistake that, in a different form, ultimately buried Dabasir in debt in the first place. And the fifth law states that gold flees from the person who forces it toward impossible earnings, who follows the seductive advice of schemers promising unrealistic returns, or who trusts their own untested judgment in matters of investment they don't genuinely understand. Each of these laws, carved into clay tablets thousands of years before modern banking existed, describes patterns that remain almost perfectly intact today. Patterns you can recognize in nearly every financial success story and every financial disaster you've ever personally witnessed, whether that story involves ancient Babylonian gold or a modern paycheck deposited directly into a checking account. Let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the specific temptations working against these ancient principles have, if anything, multiplied since Dabasir first encountered those tablets in the desert. The temptation to spend every coin as it arrives, rather than setting a portion aside first, has never been easier to give into, with instant purchases available at a single tap, removing nearly all of the natural friction that once existed between earning money and spending it. The temptation to invest in ventures you don't genuinely understand, chasing promises of unusually high returns from people lacking any real expertise, has taken on new forms, new platforms, new language, while remaining, underneath all of that modern packaging, exactly the same trap that once cost. Ark had his early savings on worthless gems, and the temptation to borrow against a future that isn't actually guaranteed. Here's the modern application worth genuinely acting on this week. something concrete, something you can start today, using principles that have already survived several thousand years of continuous testing across countless different economies and circumstances. Set aside 1/10 of whatever you earn, starting with your very next paycheck, before any other spending happens at all, treating that portion exactly the way Arcad eventually learned to, as an unavoidable obligation, rather than a leftover you'll get to if anything happens to remain. Then, before investing any of that saved money anywhere, seek out genuine expertise from someone with real, demonstrated experience in that specific area, rather than trusting the confident promises of anyone eager to take your money without actually possessing proven knowledge of whatever they're proposing. That's the entire foundation, distilled into two concrete actions that built Arcad's fortune from a scribe's modest wage, and actions that eventually rebuilt Debasir's entire life after the lowest point any person in this story ever experienced. Let's return, one final time, to that image we opened with, a man standing bound in a Babylonian marketplace, waiting to be sold like property, having lost everything he'd ever built. That man's story didn't end in that marketplace. It continued for years afterward, tending camels in a desert he never chose, reading clay tablets by circumstances he could never have predicted, and slowly, patiently, rebuilding not just his wealth, but an entirely different relationship with money itself, one built on principles simple enough to be taught to anyone, and yet rare enough, even now, that most people never actually apply them consistently. Debasir didn't return to his city wealthy because he got lucky, or because someone finally took pity on him. He returned wealthy because he applied, patiently, consistently, under circumstances far harder than nearly anyone listening to this will ever personally face. The exact same 7 cures Arcad had once taught in that great hall. The same 5 laws once carved into ancient tablets, principles that have never actually changed, regardless of how many thousands of years have passed since they were first written down. If this story of ancient wisdom that somehow still applies perfectly to a modern paycheck resonated with you at all, because somewhere out there right now, there's another person standing at their own version of that marketplace, feeling bound by debt, by circumstance, by years of decisions that seemed reasonable enough at the time, wondering if there's actually a path back to something better. There is. It was carved into clay tablets thousands of years ago, and it has never once stopped working for anyone patient enough to actually follow it.